If your last name is Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Johnson, Williams, Smith, Brown, Jones, Robinson, Harris, Davis, Freeman, Moore, King, or Franklin, stop scrolling for the next few minutes, because the story behind that name is not what most people think it is. You've probably heard someone say their surname proves they came from a certain African tribe, or that a DNA test can hand you back the exact clan your ancestors belonged to before slavery. It's a beautiful idea. It's also, in the simple version most people repeat, not quite true. The real story is more complicated, more painful in places, and honestly more interesting than the myth. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly what your surname can tell you, what it can't, and what it actually takes to trace your bloodline back to a real place and a real people on the African continent. Let's start with the biggest misconception, because it changes everything that follows. Most black surnames in America are English, not African. Not chosen by ancestors who wanted to preserve a piece of home. English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, the surnames of enslavers, of the people who legally owned human beings as property. That's not an accusation, it's just documented history. Enslaved people mostly didn't start carrying fixed surnames in large numbers until the middle of the 1700s, and that practice picked up speed as more people were freed through manumission, especially as northern states started abolishing slavery in the decades after the Revolution. By the time surnames became common and were being recorded in census documents, most enslaved families were 3, 4, 5, sometimes 7 generations, removed from the actual point where their ancestors were taken from Africa. That link, the language, the region, the specific people, had already been cut by force long before anyone was writing down a last name. So when freedom came, most formerly enslaved people did not reach for an African name to reconnect with a homeland they'd never personally known. They took the surname of the person who had enslaved them, or the surname of someone who had helped them gain their freedom, or they simply picked a name that meant something to them in that moment. Freedom, dignity, a fresh start. That's the real reason the most common surnames among black Americans today are Smith, Williams, Johnson, Brown, and Jones. Not because those were African names in disguise, because those were the most common English surnames in the American South, carried by the men and women who legally claimed ownership over other human beings and later worn by freed people as their own, on their own terms. Now let's go through the 15. Not as a random list. Each one carries its own piece of the story. Washington is one of the most recognized black surnames in the country, and it's a strange, loaded one, because it's tied directly to George Washington, a founding father who enslaved hundreds of people at Mount Vernon. After emancipation, Washington became one of the most commonly adopted surnames among freed black Americans, not always because of a direct family connection to that plantation, but because the name represented something bigger: nationhood, belonging, a claim to the same country that had denied them freedom for 2.5 centuries. Today, it remains one of the surnames most heavily concentrated among black American households in the entire country. Jefferson works almost the same way. Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people across his lifetime, and the surname spread widely after emancipation for similar reasons. Some direct descent from people enslaved at Monticello, and some simply freed people, choosing a name tied to the founding of the nation they were now claiming as full citizens of. Jackson has a slightly different story. Some of it traces back to enslavers with that surname, but a large portion also comes from Andrew Jackson's presidency and the sheer commonness of Jackson as an English surname across the South. It's also, notably, one of the surnames where later generations of black families reclaimed it and built new legacies entirely disconnected from its slaveholding origin. Think of how many black cultural icons carry that name today. Johnson is the second most common surname among black Americans, and its story is a patronymic one. It literally means son of John. It spread partly through enslavers who carried the name, and partly because it was simply one of the most widespread English surnames in circulation, meaning freed people who wanted a common, unremarkable, blend-in name gravitated toward it. Williams sits at or near the very top of the list, and it follows the same pattern. Another patronymic English surname, son of William, that was extremely common among slaveholding families, and just as common among the general Anglo population. Its sheer frequency made it a natural, low-friction choice for people building a new identity after emancipation. Smith might be the most universal surname in the English-speaking world, and that's exactly why it's so common among black Americans too. It's occupational. It originally meant a blacksmith or metalworker, and it was so widespread among white Southern families that it became one of the default surnames absorbed into black communities during and after slavery. Brown is interesting because it's descriptive rather than occupational or patronymic, originally referring to hair color, skin tone, or complexion. It became common for similar structural reasons to Smith and Johnson. It was already everywhere in the South before emancipation, so it was already attached to a huge number of enslaved households. Jones, like Williams and Johnson, is a patronymic surname, son of John again, filtered through Welsh naming conventions. It's consistently one of the top 5 most common surnames among Black Americans, again tracing back to its sheer prevalence among Southern slaveholding families rather than any single dramatic origin story. Robinson carries a slightly different texture. It's son of Robin, and it became widespread among freed Black families after emancipation, partly because it wasn't as instantly tied to a single infamous enslaver or founding father. It felt more like a fresh, ordinary English surname to build a new life under. Harris is another patronymic name, tracing to son of Harry, and it's heavily represented in the Black American surname pool for the same structural reason as most names on this list. It was one of the most common surnames carried by Southern slaveholding families, and it transferred over during and after slavery. Davis, meaning son of David, follows the same pattern, and it's worth noting how many of these names cluster around the same handful of first names, John, William, Robin, Harry, David, repeated over and over through English naming conventions for centuries before they ever crossed the Atlantic. Freeman stands apart from every name on this list, and it might be the most powerful one. This wasn't inherited from an enslaver. This was chosen. After emancipation, a significant number of formerly enslaved people specifically took the surname Freeman, sometimes recorded as Freedman, as a direct, deliberate declaration of their new legal status. It's one of the few surnames on this entire list that was picked, not passed down from someone who once owned them. Moore is an English surname with roots that are genuinely layered with irony. Historically, Moor referred to North Africans and Muslims in medieval Europe, meaning some Black families today are carrying a surname that unintentionally echoes an actual African connection, even though the name itself came through the same slaveholder to freed person pipeline as the rest. King is another one that reads differently once you know the context. Some families adopted it after emancipation as an aspirational, dignity-claiming name, much like Freeman, a way of stating their own worth in a society that had spent generations denying it. Franklin has a founding father connection too, tied loosely to Benjamin Franklin's prominence, but more broadly, it spread the same way Jackson and Jefferson did, common enough as an English surname, prominent enough as a national name, that it became a natural choice during and after emancipation. So that's the honest surname story. Almost none of it is African in origin. Nearly all of it is English, tied either directly to the people who enslaved Black Americans' ancestors or chosen deliberately after freedom as an act of self-definition. That's not a small detail. It's the whole reason DNA testing has become such a big deal in Black American communities. The surname was severed from the ancestral thread generations ago. DNA is one of the only tools left that can even attempt to reconnect it. Here's where we need to slow down and get precise, because this is the part most videos on this topic get wrong, and it's the part that actually matters if you're going to spend money on a test. DNA cannot read your surname and hand you a clan. That's not how any of this works, and any content that tells you otherwise is oversimplifying at best. What DNA testing actually does is compare small segments of your genetic code against reference databases built from people who currently live in specific regions or who have documented generations-deep roots in specific ethnic groups. Based on how closely your DNA segments match those reference populations, a company can give you a probability-based estimate, not a certainty, an estimate, of which regions or ethnic groups your ancestors most likely came from. There are 2 fundamentally different kinds of tests, and knowing the difference will save you money and disappointment. The first kind is autosomal testing. This is what companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe primarily sell. Autosomal DNA comes from all of your ancestors, mixed together, going back several generations on both your mother's and father's sides. It gives you a broad regional breakdown. For African Americans, this usually shows up as percentages tied to regions like Nigeria, Cameroon, Congo, Mali, Senegal, Benin, Togo, Ivory Coast, and Ghana, which makes sense historically, because those are the regions where the transatlantic slave trade most heavily concentrated its kidnapping and trafficking operations. Ancestry iDNA currently offers one of the largest reference databases for this kind of African regional breakdown, with over 20 distinct African regions represented in its results, and its size gives it an edge in finding both regional matches and living DNA relatives. The second kind is lineage-specific testing. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces your direct maternal line, mother to grandmother to great-grandmother and further back, and Y chromosome DNA, which traces your direct paternal line for men, father to great-grandfather. Companies like African Ancestry specialize in this. Instead of a broad regional percentage, this method can, in the right circumstances, identify one specific present-day ethnic group or people that your direct maternal or direct paternal line matches. But only that one line, and only if that specific line traces back to Africa rather than to Europe or Asia somewhere along the way, which does happen given the realities of forced mixing during slavery. If your father's 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 line happens to trace to a European ancestor instead, that test will tell you that, not force an African result where there isn't one. This is the part that matters most, so it's worth being completely direct about it. No DNA test from any company at any price. Point is giving you a 100% certain answer. Even the most reputable companies, the ones with the largest and most carefully built databases, typically operate in the range of 97% accuracy or slightly above, which is genuinely impressive, but it also means there is always a margin of error, and that margin gets wider the further back in time you're asking the test to reach. Researchers who study this field professionally, geneticists, anthropologists, bioethicists, have been raising the same concerns for years. Reference databases are built largely from people who self-report their own ancestry, which means the known ethnicity being used as a comparison point can itself be incomplete or imprecise. Most tests only trace a small portion of your overall DNA and a limited number of ancestral lines, not your entire family tree. They can produce false positives and false negatives. And there is no clean, universally agreed upon biological line between DNA, ethnicity, and race. Ethnicity in particular is a cultural and historical identity, not a purely genetic one, which means a test can tell you about population-level genetic patterns without being able to tell you what culture, language, or community your ancestors actually identified with. There's also a deeper scientific point that a lot of ancestry marketing quietly skips over. African populations hold more genetic diversity than any other population group on Earth. Geneticists studying this have found that most of the genetic variation found outside the African continent is essentially a smaller subset of the variation that already exists within Africa. That's part of why, in 2023, the National Academies of Sciences specifically recommended that researchers move away from using racial categories in genetic research altogether, because grouping people by race doesn't map cleanly onto the actual biological picture. None of this means DNA testing is worthless. It means the results deserve to be read with the same care you'd give any estimate. Useful, often moving, sometimes genuinely life-changing when it connects you to a living relative or a specific documented region, but not a court-verified, unquestionable fact stamped with the word clan. So what should you actually expect if you take one of these tests, especially carrying one of the 15 surnames above? Realistically, an autosomal test will most likely show you a spread of West and Central African regional percentages, roughly matching the documented geography of the transatlantic slave trade, plus whatever European percentage reflects the forced and coerced mixing that happened during slavery. A part of this history that's uncomfortable but factual and shows up in nearly every African American genetic profile to some degree. A mitochondrial or Y-DNA test, if you're able to afford the more specialized version, has a chance, not a guarantee, a chance of connecting one single ancestral line to a specific present-day ethnic group in Africa, which is the closest thing to an actual clan answer that current science can responsibly offer. If you want to get the most out of any of these tests, the advice from genealogists who specialize in African American research is consistent. Don't rely on DNA alone. Pair it with documentary research. Freedmen's Bureau records from the Reconstruction era, plantation records where they still exist, census data from 1870 onward. That's the first census where formerly enslaved people were recorded by full name rather than as property, and family trees built from oral history passed down through your own relatives. DNA can point you toward a region, or in the best cases, a specific people. Historical records can put names, dates, and places around that connection in a way a genetic test alone never can. Used together, they give you the fullest and most honest picture available of where you actually come from. There's something worth sitting with here before we wrap up. The story of these 15 surnames, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Johnson, Williams, Smith, Brown, Jones, Robinson, Harris, Davis, Freeman, Moore, King, Franklin, is not a story of loss with nothing on the other side of it. It's a story of people who had their names, languages, and family lines forcibly stripped away, who then took whatever materials they had left, an enslaver's surname, a founder's name, a plain English word like Freeman or King, and turned it into something that belonged to them and their descendants completely. That's not erasure. That's reclamation happening in real time, generation after generation, right up through today, where the same names are now carried by educators, engineers, athletes, artists, and everyday families who've built entirely new legacies under them. And for anyone genuinely chasing the deeper connection, the actual region, the actual people your ancestors were taken from, that door isn't closed. It's just more work than a surname alone can do. A DNA test, read honestly and paired with real documentary research, is currently the closest tool available to walk back through that severed thread. It won't hand you a guaranteed courtroom certain clan on a silver platter. But it can hand you a genuine, evidence-based starting point. A region, sometimes a specific people, sometimes even a living relative you never knew existed. And from there, the rest of the story is yours to keep uncovering. Let's go a little deeper into the timeline, because understanding when things happened explains why the surname trail goes cold so early. The first documented arrival of enslaved Africans in what would become the United States was in 1619 in Virginia. From that point forward, for close to 2 centuries, enslaved people were bought, sold, and transported across state lines constantly, which means families were broken apart long before anyone was even in a position to pass a surname down consistently. Naming during this period was largely controlled by enslavers, not by enslaved people themselves. Records from before 1808, when the legal international slave trade was formally prohibited, show enslaved people being given single names, often classical names like Caesar, Homer, Scipio, and Venus, or place names like London, Dublin, and Boston, names that had nothing to do with their actual African heritage and everything to do with what an enslaver found fitting or fashionable at the time. Nicknames were common too, especially for women. Names like Suki, Sally, Betsy, and Jenny appear constantly in records from that era. None of this was chosen by the people carrying the names. That's the uncomfortable foundation this entire naming history sits on, and it's important context before jumping into any surname's meaning. By the time the Civil War ended and emancipation became law, the naming landscape shifted dramatically, and this is really the moment that shaped the 15 surnames we've been talking about. The 1870 census is a critical marker here. It was the first federal census to record formerly enslaved Black Americans by full given name and surname, rather than simply listing them as property under someone else's household. Millions of people, essentially all at once, were formalizing surnames for official record-keeping for the first time in their lives. Some took the name of the last person who had enslaved them, simply because it was the name already associated with them in local records and easiest for continuity. Others deliberately chose a different enslaver's name, sometimes one from earlier in a family's history, sometimes one connected to a relative who had been sold away, as a way of preserving a family connection across a forced separation. Still others picked something with no personal connection to slavery at all, an occupation, a physical trait, a place, a biblical figure, or a completely invented name that simply felt like theirs. This is also the era that produced the surname Freeman in large numbers, and it's worth spending one more moment on it, because it's genuinely different from almost everything else on this list. Where a name like Washington or Jefferson carries the shadow of the exact system that enslaved people were escaping, Freeman was a name people reached for, specifically because it said the opposite. It announced legal status. It announced identity. Genealogists researching post-emancipation naming patterns consistently point to Freeman and Freedman as some of the clearest examples of enslaved people, using the naming process itself as an act of self-authorship, at a moment in history when very few other forms of self-authorship were available to them. Now, back to the science, because there's more nuance worth knowing if you're actually going to go take one of these tests rather than just read about them. Not all DNA companies are built the same way, and the differences matter more for African American ancestry specifically than for almost any other group taking these tests. Reference databases for European ancestry are, generally speaking, deep and well established, because genealogical record keeping in Europe has been more continuous and more thoroughly digitized for longer. Reference databases for African ancestry have historically been thinner, simply because comprehensive genetic sampling across the African continent, with its enormous linguistic, cultural, and genetic diversity, has lagged behind, and because the trauma of the slave trade itself destroyed so many of the record trails that would otherwise help build those connections. Companies have been working to close that gap. Ancestry DNA has invested specifically in expanding African regional reference data, and currently advertises coverage across more than 20 distinct African regions, which is part of why it's frequently recommended as a starting point for African American users. African Ancestry has spent roughly a quarter century specifically building out a large African DNA sample database focused on mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineage matches, which is why it remains the go-to option for anyone chasing a specific ethnic group match, rather than a broad regional percentage. 23andMe and Living DNA offer their own versions of regional breakdowns as well, each with their own database, size, and strengths, and each worth comparing before you commit to one over another. One more practical piece of advice worth including here: whichever test you choose, don't treat the first report you get back as the final word. These regional percentages update over time as companies expand their reference databases and refine their algorithms. It's extremely common for someone's ethnicity estimate to shift somewhat between when they first test and a year or two later, simply because the underlying comparison data has grown. That's not the test being wrong the first time. It's the science getting more precise as more people contribute samples, and as researchers refine how they read the patterns. If you tested years ago and haven't checked back recently, it's worth logging in and looking again, because the picture may well have changed. It's also worth being honest about a tension that sits underneath all of this. Race, as a category, doesn't map cleanly onto biology. Genetic diversity within Africa alone is greater than the diversity found across every other population on Earth combined, which makes black as a single genetic category far less precise than it sounds in everyday conversation. Ethnicity, meanwhile, is a lived cultural identity, language, custom, community, history, not something that can be fully captured by a swab of saliva and an algorithm. DNA testing companies don't always make that distinction obvious in their marketing, and that's part of why the phrase "your true clan" can be misleading if it's taken too literally. What these tests can responsibly offer is a genetic population match, a statistically strong likelihood that your ancestry traces to a certain region or, in the best lineage, specific cases, specific present-day ethnic group. What they can't do is hand you your ancestors' actual language, their actual customs, their actual community identity, because that information was never encoded in DNA to begin with. It lived in culture, and culture is exactly what the slave trade worked hardest to sever. None of this is meant to talk anyone out of testing. If anything, it's the opposite. Knowing exactly what a test can and can't do makes the results that do come back mean more, not less. When someone gets a mitochondrial DNA result back and it points to a specific documented ethnic group in West Africa, that's not a marketing gimmick. That's a real, evidence-based genetic match, arrived at through legitimate lineage tracing methods that geneticists have used and refined for decades. When someone matches with a living relative through an autosomal database and ends up building a real relationship with family they never knew existed, that's not hype either. That happens constantly, and it's one of the most powerful uses of this technology for African American families specifically, precisely because the documentary paper trail so often goes cold at slavery's wall. So here's the honest bottom line for anyone carrying one of these 15 surnames and wondering what to do next. Your surname alone will not tell you your ancestral ethnic group. For the overwhelming majority of Black Americans, it's an English name inherited from an enslaver or chosen fresh at emancipation, not a preserved fragment of African heritage. What can get you closer to that answer is DNA testing done with realistic expectations. An autosomal test for a broad regional picture and potential living relative matches, a mitochondrial or Y-DNA test if you want a shot at a specific ethnic group match along one direct line, and documentary research. Census records, Freedmen's Bureau archives, family oral history, layered on top to fill in the gaps DNA can't reach on its own. Put those pieces together, and you get the fullest, most accurate picture currently available of where your family actually comes from. It's not a single dramatic reveal, it's a process. But for a history that was deliberately and violently disconnected from its roots, that process is exactly how the connection gets rebuilt, one verified piece at a time.